Welcome back. When we contrasted the two breathing types in the previous video, it's both how they breathe while they're exercising, and it's also about how much they breathe when they're at rest. Breathing is one of the few functions of our body which has a dual controls, and you can control it with your mind for a short while, and it's also, of course, controlled by your nervous system. When it's controlled by your nervous system, then there are these specialized receptors in the aorta and the carotid arteries which monitor pH and CO2 levels in your fluids. They sense when the CO2 is raised to a certain threshold level, and it sends that information up to the brainstem, triggering a nerve impulse to fire down the phrenic nerve, which goes to the diaphragm. This causes the diaphragm to contract, and then this initiates a breath ventilating out the CO2 and bringing it back down, bringing the CO2 back down to a safe level. Those sensors are responding to CO2 levels. They're not responding to oxygen. And this is because our body, our respiration is most importantly about CO2 and secondarily about oxygen. But if our nerve system has gotten out of balance for reasons which you'll explore in this video, then we can become too sensitive to CO2, and this triggers breathing to happen more than it should, and then we can become out of balance physically and mentally. When we need more energy to run or fight or exercise, our metabolism creates energy, and then CO2 is like the exhaust from the process. And our bodies then, of course, speed up to ventilate out this buildup of CO2. And this is part of the sympathetic nerve system, the fight-flight response, and this also does other things in the body at the same time. It activates secondary muscles of breathing in the back and neck and shoulders to physically open up our chest for bigger inhalations and more exhalations, and it also dilates the pupils and speeds the heart rate up. And this is meant to take place for just a short duration. It's not meant to live this way. However, just a thought can trigger an increase in breathing speed. And this is one of the ways in which our breathing can be controlled by the mind, but in an unconscious way. So, if we feel anxious or we feel fearful, the brain doesn't know if the threat is real or if it's imagined. And the same chain of responses happen. We respond to mentally created stress as if it were a real threat that we should physically fight or run away from. And that's why as someone who's stressed, even if just in their thoughts, in their mind, and they're not moving anymore, but they're breathing faster. And if they're not moving more, then the CO2 isn't being generated at any greater volumes because the muscles don't require more energy. And yet the breathing is speeding up, so the breathing is ventilating out the CO2 faster than it's being produced. And this quickly takes somebody into a low CO2 state, which is called hypocapnia. If we go into hypocapnia, then we have all these fight-flight responses of increased heart rate and pupil dilation, the shrinking of the blood vessels, constriction of the lungs, and because of the Bohr effect, less oxygen goes to the cells. This state is also quite mind-altering. So if we're in a stressful state of mind and we start to hyperventilate, we lower CO2, and then this causes a rapid pulse and tense muscles, and these symptoms reinforce the perception that something is wrong. This can cause more anxiety, and we breathe even more in a reaction to that stress, and this creates a vicious loop. Of course, we all have moments in time where we feel stress, and breathing in excess of our body's needs at that moment. But if the stress continues long term and becomes a personality trait, and whether that's through a habit of looking at the world or oneself in a negative way or holding unresolved trauma at a somatic level, then we can become so oriented towards vigilance that we end up breathing in excess of what we need for good health. And as a consequence, our nerve system habituates to a low level of CO2. And this means that our sensors, which are monitoring CO2 in the fluids, become too sensitive. And this triggers breathing to happen more and more often. And this can become a vicious cycle where the more that you overbreathe, and it's like a mechanical, automated process which can become quite debilitating for your health and your state of mind. And it's quite common. In fact, it's been estimated that breathing habits account for roughly 60% of emergency ambulance calls in US city hospitals. 60%! But short of calling 911, if you or someone you know regularly experiences anxiety or fear, brain fog, memory problems, or you get tired or fatigued really easily and you're, say, breathless, this can be due to oversensitivity to CO2 and a chronic overbreathing habit. And it could be that, say, the mental and emotional and physical problems that are ongoing, that a person starts to seek answers or healing for them, the whole time not suspecting that it could be due to overbreathing, or at least partially due to overbreathing. And of course, these problems are multifaceted and they're often complex, but one of the most powerful tools you have for change is what's right underneath your own nose. And our task here is to lower our sensitivity to CO2. And we do this by increasing CO2 through conscious breathing practices. And thereby, it triggers less breathing overall. And when we have a healthy level of CO2 in the body, we will have better blood flow to the tissues, improved delivery of oxygen to the cells, and a more relaxed state of mind and body. Now, a low CO2 state can also be useful, however, so keep that in mind. If you're doing it in a short duration and done in a context of consciously inducing the state of hypocapnia, like through conscious connected breath work, then the effects of that experience are interpreted not through a lens of stress, but through the context in which you're in, which can be intentional and supportive. And this brings on a psychedelic-like state in which one can experience catharsis and healing. In our practice here, we're also using conscious connected breath work in a short duration. And this allows us to lower the CO2 to a level where we can suspend the breathing afterwards. And thereby, we can consciously experience the buildup of CO2 and the responses that our body goes through, and allows us to pacify those responses so that we can gradually condition our nervous system to trigger less breathing overall. And this will take you from being breathless to having more energy. Let's look at how that happens in the next video.